Hi, everybody. Welcome to Politics of Self. This month, we are taking on the subject of the Panama Papers. Now, I'm sure all of you have heard about the Panama Papers by now. If not, there are plenty of news sources that'll give you all of the bare bones details. But today's Hangout is going to be talking about something that's not going to be generally covered when talking about the Panama Papers. We're talking about the element of self and how the Panama Papers event in many ways mirrors the kinds of things we go through on an individual level. So for today's talk on the politics of self Panama Papers, we are joined by my co-host Kelly from Seattle.
Hello, everyone.
And myself, yours truly, Joe from California. So to kind of get everybody caught up on the subject of the Panama Papers, this is, of course, something that happened fairly recently, but when we deal with leaks like this, when we're talking about massive dumps of data that lead people to have an opinion about the people that are exposed, you really have to slow down and question the source. And then also you have to question the results. So when you're looking at the Panama Papers this time, it has the same patterns as many of the previous massive leaks that we've had, whether you're talking about the Pentagon Papers or WikiLeaks or what have you. It's that these leaks are oftentimes very controlled in terms of what is actually released and what is actually, in many ways, allowed to enter the public consciousness. In the term of the Panama Papers, you're dealing with several million documents, and it's very questionable how much out of that is actually given to the public. I mean, none of us are allowed to look at the data. The only people that were allowed to really look at it were the few that were involved in the investigation and the reporting. And all of that, I just thought was really suspect. But what is your feedback on that, Kelly?
Yeah, well, even a lot of the information that was leaked out is sort of these ambiguous claims. That's like, well, there may have been this, and there possibly was this, and none of it is really super concrete. And you have to question then, what's being claimed, and is there anything really behind it? When it's so loose like that, what is really the purpose behind it? It's obviously to generate a specific kind of opinion or stance toward who's being exposed. Because we don't tend to check the facts and question what is being presented, we tend to just trust these sources and go along with what's being said, even when it's not even specific, and we can't even check it for ourselves. Like you're saying, we don't even have access to these things. We can't even read it ourselves, so we're having to go off the word of a few, and within that, we have to question what would be a motive behind this. Who stands to benefit from this? Who stands to lose from this? Because we know that we can't necessarily trust the information, especially if we can't even evaluate it ourselves. How can we trust that?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting the way that it's framed. I mean, you're talking about this huge, massive data dump, an order of magnitude larger than WikiLeaks itself. And it's really just, it's so blatant, isn't it? The fact that the only people that seem to be targeted are enemies of the foundations that supported this leak, this reporting. I just find that so convenient. And when you look at the people kind of behind the scenes, the foundations, you're looking at George Soros, the Open Society Foundation, the Ford Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. All of these pro-Western, pro-institute organizations that have their signature behind it. And yet you don't see any of them being called out. You don't see any of them on the list of this huge data dump. So are we to think that Americans or the West are somehow not at all participating in the same offshore tax haven scheme? I mean, is that the narrative that we're left with? Because if it is, I think that's very insulting to the intelligence of people. And my stand on this would be that, obviously this kind of thing happens. Large corporations, political figures, people who have to run their businesses in ways that are not exactly legal, yes, will use these tax havens as a way to continue functioning, to not be held accountable, to not have to put everything they have on the books because that would get them entangled in other things. So that's not a surprise, and it shouldn't be to anybody. But the way that it's being framed, it's as though only these bad people are doing this. And look at how they're all connected to Putin. Look at how they're all connected to Assad and all of these bad people who, because they're using these offshore havens, they're probably using this to fund their war machines and their campaign against freedom. And it's just so it's so insulting, at least to me, that this kind of thing is allowed to enter the public mainstream and not have a counterbalancing opinion. It's just a crazy town. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, definitely. I mean, the fact that it's only pointing out some who participate in this is really questionable, because it's not, this is being done everywhere by everyone who is in a position to do so. It's such a standard practice, and we tend to think of maybe just big names or big companies being involved in this, but it's even at an individual level. Anyone who has a significant amount of money, is faced with this option, this decision of, what am I going to do with that money? And this is a very pragmatic thing to do from that perspective, in terms of having it in an offshore account, especially if you maybe want to have some decision with what is done with your money, and you don't necessarily want to contribute it to the government because maybe you don't like what they're doing with it or what have you. So this is a very common practice done by many levels of individuals up to businesses, and it's really questionable that we don't recognize that we have the finger being pointed at some of the people doing this. What about the rest? Wouldn't it bring that also into question? What does it say about how little we're paying attention, that we don't even recognize that only some are being called out and others aren't? And this is where it brings us into a kind of a double standard, because we tend to look at those who are being blamed, the others, them who are doing this, and not even check, wait, are some members of our own government, our own country doing this? And what's it say about that? If it's so nefarious that someone else is doing it, is it not the same for everyone else who's doing it? I mean, these are the questions that are not being asked when we're just taking what's being said as it is, and, oh my goodness, look what they've done. Wait, are we really objectively looking at the entire situation here?
Yes, and to that point, again, let me remind our viewers, we are live and we are taking your questions. So if you have any comments, feedbacks, let us know. We have one coming in now from Marlene. Marlene says, we are conditioned by media to see this as a scandal, instead of rather seeing the scandal on how people's taxes are used for military purposes that most of the population would not agree to destine their resources to. So aren't these double standards? Yes, absolutely. And thank you so much for that question, Marlene. To this point, I would say that this is a legitimate concern, because when we pay our taxes, we don't get a form that says, okay, I agree to pay how much tax I must pay, but I want my taxes to go to this program. I want my taxes to fund this social benefit. I want my taxes to fix these roads that are immediately beneficial to me. We don't get to say any of that. We don't have any say when it comes to the government using our tax dollars to fund its own war chest. We don't have any say when our government wants to have military adventures overseas to protect its interests. We don't have any say when the government is in bed with basically the military-industrial complex that has a constant hunger for more military contracts, which means more and more big-ticket items, more and more bombs and planes that cost millions of dollars and have very little domestic beneficial use. And all of our tax dollars often go to that or other things that frankly don't really benefit us, frankly don't in fact do anything that make our lives better or more secure. I would argue often it makes the opposite true. So when we're talking about people that are taking their money and putting it in places where it is not liable to taxation by government, we get this sense that it's being framed like it's something wrong, something onerous, something, oh, how dare you? Well, why don't we have that same standard applied to the way our government uses the tax dollars that often it demands from the public, many times by threat, by sheer force? What is your perspective on that, Kelly?
Yeah, well, there's a great irony in this because, in a way, to bring this back as a reflection on ourselves as individuals and how we relate to the players on the big scale, it's the same point. If these individuals with large sums of money don't want to participate and they want to, in the government, and they want to have some choice over what their money is used for, this is, that's definitely one of the reasons that you would be tempted to use an offshore account, so that you don't fund these things that you fundamentally don't agree with, because there are so many things that the majority of the population doesn't necessarily agree with, but don't have a choice in terms of where our tax money goes. And so isn't what they're doing is just the same thing that many wish they could do? Wouldn't we all like to have a say over how our money is being used in the government? So it's kind of funny that within that you could say maybe there's even almost a subconscious kind of jealousy, like that's not fair that they can do that and we don't get to, which really the solution then is not to vilify them for that, but would be to rather look at, well, how do we go about changing our system so that, changing legislation so that we do have that option, So it's kind of ironic that what we blame on the large scale is maybe what we would actually want for ourselves,
And that's actually a really good segue to our next question. This comes in from Rebecca Dalmas, and the question is it not a classic form of cognitive dissonance to point a finger at what another is doing to move attention from the very same action in the one pointing the finger? And is this not what so many of us do in our everyday lives? Awesome, excellent question, and this speaks to the heart of what politics of self is all about. Bringing these events, these seemingly massive world news events back to the self and realizing that the things that we're judging other people for doing are actually reflections of our own individual lives, our own individual acceptances, our own individual flaws. And we're going to get right into that. Thank you, Rebecca, for that excellent question. To take this point on, I would say that what we're seeing right now with these Panama Papers or any major news event or crisis, what ends up happening is, in fact, a kind of cognitive dissonance where we end up pointing the finger at others and saying, oh my God, look what they're doing. Look what they are doing, and now look at what we are forced to do as a response. Now they did this, so I have to respond. I'm forced to step in and provide a solution. Right? So this is the old Hegelian dialectic of problem, reaction, solution. In the case of the Panama Papers, we're seeing people being exposed, and we're talking about billions of dollars that are hidden in offshore accounts. But let's have a look at the West, shall we? We've got quadrillions of dollars in derivatives that nobody seems to want to talk about. So where is that line to be drawn? I mean, this is so evidently a double standard going on. Kelly, what's your feedback on that?
Yeah, well, this is a technique that's pretty commonly used. You know, the idea of putting the blame on someone else to draw attention from somewhere else, and look at all the problems that you just mentioned. You know, that we have here in the United States. And boy, doesn't it, isn't it sure convenient to be able to point a finger at someone else doing something so nefarious so that it takes away any focus from the issues that are going on right here. I mean, that ties back even to that point of wanting to do something with your own taxes. You know, let's rather get mad at someone else who's got the ability to do something that we would like to have, instead of focusing on, well, how do we change things so that we have that ability ourselves? You know, it's always a diversion of the attention from one thing to another, instead of, looking at, well, how do we actually get to the source of this problem so that we can change it?
One thing I thought was very, very funny to me, at least, was so you're talking about all of these foreign people, right? And none of these are U.S. people. We're good. We're fine. But all of these bad foreign people that have all of this money that is not accounted for, and look, oh, you've got these world leaders and all of these prominent figures and organizations that are hiding their money. How dare they? So what is the response to that? And what are we supposed to do about that? If that's the problem, well, you would be led to the conclusion then that, well, maybe it's not such a bad idea to loosen the grip of government so that they can reach into these offshore accounts, these private accounts, and take back what is rightfully the government's tax money, right? Are we really left to go to that conclusion? Because that seems to be the narrative that they're spinning, isn't it? So to kind of frame this point out, we're dealing with what's called a limited hangout. This is an intelligence technique. So let's say you are in a position where you are about to be exposed for something horrible, terrible, something that just you will never recover from, and it will probably get you in a lot of trouble, if not imminent death. Right? That's something so bad that if people ever found out, you would be immediately removed. Well, what do you do in a situation like that? Well, to get around that, you do what's called the limited hangout operation, which is you deliberately plant information that seems to damn you for a lesser crime, and you play it up so that, oh, it's the secret thing that just got exposed. This was never supposed to come out to the public. This was never supposed to have gotten out to people, and now it's been exposed by these rogue elements within my organization. And now that it's exposed, I'm in a bad position. I gotta fess up to this now. Poor me. So you're seeing the same thing happen. It's the limited hangout operation. This is actually, in fact, an intelligence operation. If you really look into it, this is something that's in their playbook. There is a way to do this, and it has been done in the past. And whether or not you want to include things like WikiLeaks, Edward Snowden, Julian Assange, whether or not they were part of these operations, that's for you to decide. But you do have to recognize there is a pattern here of conveniently creating these narrative stories, pointing the finger at other people, or pointing the finger at a lesser crime, so that you look like somebody that's, poor them. Yeah, I mean, it was messed up what they did, but now they're caught, now they're exposed, now they're gonna face what's coming to them.
And look, they're owning up to it. So how respectful of them that they're taking responsibility for their mistake.
Right. So like
they become kind of a hero.
Yeah. And you actually see this happening right before you in this Panama Papers thing. And there has been no mention about the quadrillions of derivatives and debt that the U.S. and primarily the Western institutions have accumulated through all of these swaps throughout the past few decades. I mean, nobody's mentioned any of that. And I think it's also very convenient that we haven't really hit China with any of this, because China's Actually, China owns the debt of the West. Okay, so if we were to poke China too hard, this would create too much blowback. So you actually see that reflected in how the Panama Papers story is playing out. It's primarily focused on attacking Vladimir Putin and Russia and Assad and these current enemies of the day for the West.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even if you don't have anything concrete to say, you can only make insinuations and possibly and maybes. Still, just even saying something like that, incriminating someone, is going to have an effect.
Yeah.
It's like the person who has to go to court for being accused of something, that's seen in the public eye as really horrible. Even if they end up being exonerated from it, it's still going to stick with them. Their reputation is still forever changed. So that's...
It reminds me of like in our personal lives, if you want to smear somebody, it's really not that hard to really completely mess somebody up just by spreading rumors and consistently spreading it. It can be like, I heard that John, don't take it from me, but I heard. And you just keep saying that, and eventually it's going to catch on and become a meme. And in Western media, specifically Western media, it's exactly that tactic. Now, it's not mentioned Vladimir Putin directly, but if you look at his associates and who those associates associate with, and those associated with them by association, so it's the same game. And it's so ridiculous. And all you have to look at is who's being excluded and who's being harped on, and you'll see what the agenda is. It's very clear. But to wrap up this question from Rebecca, you do mention that, is this not what so many of us do in our own everyday lives? Yes, absolutely. I think it's really interesting how there's this public outrage, this public, oh my God, these political figures are lying to us, and they're hiding money, and they're not being accountable. How dare they not be accountable? We got to do something about those guys. When we don't slow down and realize, okay, well, first of all, let's look at these people, okay? Let's look at these organizations and the context that they exist in. We have a society where we put people into positions of power and authority, and we need to believe that they are infallible, that they are perfect beings who always do the right thing on our behalf, who always have the best interest of everybody at all times. And any time they do something wrong or bad, that reflects poorly on us. And then we get irate as though we have this insane idea that, these people should just always be perfect, and the system is perfect if you just have the right people running it. No, come on, people.
My shiny armor is not so shiny after all.
Yeah, so we actually talked about this the other night during the pre-chat, where we were talking about, we want this idea of the shining knight, the knight in shining armor. But newsflash, a knight in shining armor is a knight that's never seen battle. Okay, you have a guy that just looks
slapped on some armor.
Right.
So that looked really good.
So we have this double standard going on, where we expect all of these people to do and be the kinds of people that we are not. And the fact is, the majority of the population are fallible people with problems and issues. And yes, we do often end up doing things we regret, things that we wish we didn't have to do, but we end up doing anyway for survival or because of the circumstances of our situations. And we then expect the people in charge, people who are in positions of being responsible for societies, for cities, for entire nations sometimes, to in some way not have to deal with that same stress, that same burden of responsibility, that same fallible human nature. I think that's a very immature way of dealing with this. So when we're looking at all of these people doing these offshoring things and putting money into tax havens, not having them be accountable, really what we're dealing at is our own trust being betrayed. But within this, I mean, yes, the people that are abusing the system for nefarious things need to be addressed, need to be dealt with. It is a problem. But when we're assigning blame without looking at ourselves in the big picture, we're really missing the entire equation here, because it takes two to tango. And we as a society are not innocent. We are ourselves manipulative. We are ourselves secretive. We are ourselves deceptive. So to point the finger and not realize that these are things that we are individually struggling with as well is a disservice. What is your take on that, Kelly?
Yeah, well, I mean, you have uh, these individuals who are in positions that the majority of us are not. And we have this ridiculous expectation of them that we don't even hold ourselves to. You know, we hold them to an entirely different standard than we hold ourselves to, and we've kind of accepted that within this idea and this hope and this desire that there's someone who can take care of us. There's someone who's going to manage things for us and make all the decisions for us, because that's hard to do. And there's responsibility within that. We don't want that responsibility. So we give it to other people, and then they have to shoulder all that responsibility. And we just want to blissfully hope and wish that they're going to have our best interest at heart all the time, even though we ourselves don't focus on everyone's interest all the time.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when we see these individuals who are obviously operating out of their own interest and we get angry, we have to evaluate, do we not, the majority of the time, are acting on our own interest ourselves?
Mm-hmm.
Are we taking into account the interest of everyone? Is it really reasonable to expect that a portion of the population can, you know, a very minority part of the population can be responsible for the rest of the population and make all the decisions? Does that actually work that way? Is it not more than we can actually ask for people to do? And when we ourselves are putting it into positions like that, do we not face the same points that they will face in terms of the decisions that they get to make? And like, now you're in a position where, I get to make the decisions. Well, maybe I can make a decision that's going to work out in my favor. You know, I mean, these are the kind of things that we're even faced with as individuals when, say, you're a parent.
Mm-hmm.
You have kids. You're the decision maker. You know, are you always deciding what's best for everyone? Or are there sometimes where you're deciding, you know what, I'm going to tell my child this because I want their behavior to be like this, because I really want to take a nap right now, or something like that. I mean, granted, parents tend to not get enough sleep, but but for example, we have manipulation even in that very base, small form of a relationship. And it's the same thing that we see on the greater scale.
Yes.
We do this in all levels where we're putting our interests first. So to get irate at seeing it on a bigger scale, to those who we've held to a higher standard than we've even held ourselves, is just ridiculous and can't pan out.
I think it's a wake-up call, really. Not so much, I mean, it should not at all surprise anybody at this point that this happens. And the reaction of the people, this outrage, it's not against them. The outrage, I would say, is that feeling of a trust being betrayed. And when I talk about this trust being betrayed, it also speaks to our tendency to need to believe that the people in charge, that the people that we kind of offshore our responsibilities to, be perfect beings, and they turn out to not be. It boils down to the individual level. If you want to take the example like you raised about parents, you know, we want to believe that our parents are good people, that we can trust them, that their decisions when it comes to doing what's best for us are good and can be just simply trusted. You shouldn't have to ever question them. You know, that's what we would like. But it turns out these parents, these figures, turn out to just be human beings, just like us, and they make mistakes, and you know, their judgment isn't always perfect. And you know, there comes that uncomfortable realization within you that, well, you can't just blindly trust, and you cannot expect them to always make the best decisions for you. And there comes a time when you have to either, in some cases, rebel, or you have to face them and start asserting your own responsibility, demonstrating that you can take responsibility for yourself better than they can take responsibility for you. Now, we as a society, I think, are getting to that point where we've got to start asking, okay, all of these people that we have in charge of us right now, these world leaders, these financial institutions, and all of these organizations that we have in charge and are trusted to administer to our well-being, can they reasonably continue to function the way they are, and still have us really have a society that's good and trustworthy? And I would say no. So we are at that stage now. Are we going to end up rebelling? I hope not, because that would create a lot of chaos, a lot of pain for everybody. I really strongly hope and urge that we rather get to that point of transition. It's about realizing that for so long we've expected too much of people to do things for us that we need to be doing for ourselves. And this doesn't mean taking the government out. This doesn't mean overthrowing anybody. This is about realizing that we can do a better job at taking care of ourselves, educating ourselves, becoming more responsible and more aware of our world and how we're creating it. And we can start, changing the dynamic of what it means to be in power. We can change the dynamic of what it means to have a government, and what is a government when the majority of people reasonably take responsibility for themselves and each other. What does government become then? I think those are the questions that we really need to deeply dive into and start exploring.
Yeah. Yeah, like what is really the purpose of the government? I mean, if it's meant to be representative of the people, and which, I'm sure that a lot of people are under that impression that our government is supposed to represent the wishes of the people. But we know that it doesn't, because it's become more of a decision-making body, making decisions for the people, rather than being more like an extension of the people who make decisions for themselves, and then the government is there to administrate and carry through those decisions. Similar to what we've seen within, like, if you study Indian government structures. The leaders were a representative of the people, and if you didn't act accordingly to what the people wanted, you didn't last in that position very long. But we have here this relationship where we've given away our responsibility within this kind of relationship of it being apparently easier, and wouldn't it be just so nice if we could trust others to take responsibility and not make decisions that aren't in our best interest, just like we do. We know it happens because we do it. Wouldn't it be so nice? And isn't it easier that way? But the point here is, when we, instead of vilifying, a part of the population and blaming them, that's not going to lead to any kind of an actual solution here for the same things that we're doing. It's only going to distract us from considering what's the solution to these kind of things. How do we, as human beings, face these moments where we have decisions to make and not choose what's in our own self-interest over the interest of everyone together?
Mm-hmm.
How do we do that? Can we even do that? Are we faced with positions that don't allow us to do that, where we have to choose our self-interest? Does that bring forth some understanding then of why someone makes those decisions in those situations? I mean, we have to get to understand our experience, the context of the world in which we live, to see why we make the decisions we make, and how can we change that, the underlying foundation of our society and our economy, so that we can make different decisions. Because otherwise, if we don't change that, the core of it, we're always going to be making decisions in the context of how things are, and things are not nice. We have to make decisions that put our interests first. So the point being, stop misdirecting your focus onto those who are in the limelight for, what this nefarious activities, and rather bring it back to ourselves and look at how do we actually change where this behavior is even coming from.
Yes, absolutely. So to quickly recap what we covered today, we were talking about the Panama Papers that has been in the news as of late, and we're looking at firstly the dimension of what are these leaks, and to understand anytime you have these massive leaks, they are often controlled and contrived, and you have to be very critical about the conclusions that these leaks are leading you toward. And in this case, we talked about the need to recognize that the West has, by and large, gotten a pass on this whole Panama scandal. And we need to look at the source of that and question why the narrative is being spun to kind of gear up a public sentiment against Assad and against Putin, and by extension, against people who offshore their money and try to hide from the government. Because that is an important agenda that you need to see through, because our ignorance is acting against us in this case. We also talked briefly about the double standard that we're seeing, where oftentimes we want our political leaders and these organizations in the world to be better versions of ourselves, and yet we have yet to become those versions for ourselves as ourselves, meaning we want these people to do things perfectly, and we expect them to be who we aren't yet. And I say yet because that is still our potential. So when we're faced with this outrage, when we find out that, oh my God, these political figures and these organizations are not perfect beings, and they're doing things that are not actually best for everybody, we got to take that back to ourselves and ask ourselves, well, am I just as guilty for not living up to that potential that I want them to be exemplars of? We also talked about the idea of the limited hangout, which is the idea that when somebody wants to get ahead of an imminent exposure, when somebody wants to get themselves out of trouble, this is a known technique to work, which is you allow information to come out that seems damning and seems bad, but is an order of magnitude less than your actual crimes or what you're actually afraid of being exposed for. So we have to look at, well, what are these institutions really afraid of? Because we're pointing the finger at other people and saying, oh, how dare these people for doing this? Well, that kind of really indicates to you that there's a lot more going on by the people who were left out of this exposure. You really have to look at what's going on there, because they seem to be the ones that are not getting any of the flack at all. And isn't that convenient for somebody that wants to not be exposed for something? So to wrap that all up into one bundle as we close this segment, I want to toss this out to all of you viewers right now. If you have any questions, now is the time. And always, within looking at any news event, anything you see in the public mainstream, always bring it back to the politics of self. Because what we're witnessing is not, political figures and organizations. What we're seeing is reflections of who we are collectively and as individuals. We are all just as guilty. We are all just as prone to hide and engage in these tactics of manipulation and cheating. So if we want our politicians to not do that, let's be the first ones to stop that in ourselves. Any feedback or closing arguments from you, Kelly?
Well said. I definitely concur. I think that wraps it up really well.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Looks like we have no questions coming in at this time, but if you're catching this on the rebroadcast, do feel free to leave us comments and we will do our best to respond. For Politics of Self, this has been Joe and Kelly. Thank you very much. Stay tuned to this channel. Come back to us, and we will be joined again by our regularly scheduled host, Marlene, for the Living Income Guaranteed. And we will see you again next month for another edition of Politics of Self. Thank you very much.
See you next time.